Hey everybody, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Jenda, also known as Joseph, and this is the history of the world. We are now passing by 3000 BCE into a new millennium. In the last few centuries, we've seen human civilization grow very rapidly. There are now at least 5 major river civilizations in the world. On the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Tigris and Euphrates together, the Indus, the Yangtze, and the Yellow Rivers. So essentially, 2 in what we might call the Middle East, 1 in northwestern India, and 2 in China. Moreover, agricultural civilization is spreading out pretty substantially, especially around Sumeria and Egypt, or Mesopotamia and Egypt. Anatolia, the Persian steppes, even the Greek islands are seeing increasing levels of settlement. Among other developments, bronze, now the most sought-after metal in the world. Still a bit rare, though. Copper is much more readily available. No one has yet found a good tin source to alloy with copper to make bronze, not in an industrial quantity. Egypt is united under one pharaoh, Dir, while Sumeria is mostly dominated by the city-state of Uruk, but other city-states are increasingly coming to rival it as we enter this new millennium. The world population as a whole is now about 60 million people, growing very slowly, but growing nonetheless. Fast forward 2900. In China, the Yangshao culture is being supplanted by the Longshan culture along the Yellow River. This change is marked by, well, you guessed it, the transition in pottery styles. The difference, well, it seems the pottery wheel has arrived in China, maybe invented there separately, maybe traded, quite possibly invented there separately. In any case, they're now producing thin-walled, polished black pottery, which shows quite an impressive degree of technical skill. Beyond that, the Longshan culture appears to be based mainly on growing millet, along with rice and some wheat. They raise mostly pigs, some sheep and goats. This is the society based mainly along the Yellow River. They're becoming slowly more developed. They have an increasing number of reasonably sized towns, more complex social classes and occupations. They're definitely, to put it crudely, they're behind the Fertile Crescent, but they're definitely on the way to their own independent civilization. Meanwhile, in Sumeria, the shekel is now coming into use. Not a coin, it's a standardized unit of measurement equating to about 11 grams, although this varies rapidly to a considerable degree between cities, but it's almost impossible to keep a perfect standardization of that kind of thing. Well, it just is impossible, given the means available at this time. Now, Sumeria is becoming increasingly fractured in this year of 2900, to the point I'm beginning to think Uruk's days as undisputed top dog may be nearing their end. A lot of the other cities, some of them originally settled from Uruk, others maybe settled separately, but either way, they've all adopted sort of the ways that were developed in Uruk, and they've grown to the point where they're major powers in their own right, a lot of them. On the lower rivers, closer to the Gulf, we have the likes of Lagash, Umma, Nippur, various others. This is sort of the heartland of Sumeria. Further upriver, we have a number of Semitic-speaking cities. These are Kish, Mari, Nagar, Ebla, numerous others. There is a divide here. The core Sumerian cities close to the Gulf speak, well, Sumerian. The cities further upriver mostly speak a Semitic language. We're just going to call it literally Semitic at this time. There's definitely some sort of cultural division here, but it's also just a geographical division. It's not necessarily... It would be very incorrect probably to assume that the Sumerian cities uniformly are, that there's any sort of rivalry on a large scale between the Sumerian and the Semitic cities. At this point, your main rival is your closest neighbor city, which is probably speaking the same language as you. That's just how it goes in a city-state system like this. Your closest neighbor that's of any size, anyway. And make no mistake, it is a city-state system that we have emerging here. A bunch of cities, all independent from each other, varying sizes, most of them large enough to pose a credible threat to any other city under the right circumstances, and they're competing over the ultimately quite limited land between and alongside the Tigris and the Euphrates, plus resources, and maybe just over prestige and control, but the land and resources are the most fundamental thing. The upstream cities have a lot more land relative to their population, but that land is not as good for agriculture. The populations close to the Gulf are much denser. Unfortunately, we don't really have any exact record of what exactly is going on there. There's no real information reaching us on political developments. There is a Sumerian king list that we found which suggests that Kish's leaders are the first kings emerging around this time. But I think that it would be very dangerous to assume this actually means they're kings of the whole area. It's probably partially propaganda. Maybe we can say that Kish has become one of the most influential cities at this moment, although very likely still behind Uruk, really. We do, fortunately, have better information over in Egypt, thanks to their habit of building gigantic tombs in the desert, where they are preserved for us to study. Dier is the ruler as of the start of the millennium, and he keeps ruling for as much as 20 years after, before dying after a reign of probably 41 years in all. He's buried with 318 sacrificed retainers in a grand tomb in Abydos with the rest of the First Dynasty, and he's succeeded by his son Diet and Diet's sister wife Mernith. Now, Diet likely reigns for about 10 fairly uneventful years, alongside Mernith. There are some later reports that suggest a famine might have occurred. These were written down thousands of years later, though. There are no primary sources, no contemporary information, that is, demonstrating for sure that a famine occurred. That being said, we would all do well to remember that agriculture is maybe not in its infancy exactly, but a toddler at best. The science is very far from exact. Even today it's not exact, but it's at this time it's still very much, let's put it this way, a couple of bad years of drought, anything like that, any disruption to the harvest, running even, they had granaries and stores and such, but any disruption to the harvest lasting more than a year or two would almost certainly cause a major famine at any point, both at this time and for the next, frankly, the bulk of the next 5,000 years, only really in the last few hundred has this sort of thing been really ameliorated. So anyway, Diet reigns for 10 years. There's no major developments for Egypt. Maybe a famine, maybe there isn't. There's famines, frankly, every few decades. There's almost certainly some sort of, at least small famine. On his death, he's buried with 174 retainers in Abydos. What happens just after that is not quite clear. Most likely, as he dies, his son Den is too young to take the throne, and so Mernith takes power as his regent for some years. It's not certain to us, there's some considerable debate over whether Mernith is ever officially crowned in her own right. Either way, she effectively rules Egypt for at least a few years until Den comes of age, and on her death, she's buried at Abydos next to Diet in her own separate tomb, as grand as his, almost identical in size, actually, which kind of suggests that, well, even if she wasn't crowned, she exercised enough effective power to give herself the honors of a pharaoh. Now, when their son Den does take power in his own right, He fortunately proves to be up to the task. He rules for something on the order of 42 years, starting about 2970 BCE. He engages in all the usual business you expect from a pharaoh. He builds temples and canals. He leads religious ceremonies and festivals. More than once, he leads campaigns against the nomads and raiders in the Sinai and the other deserts bordering Egypt. He, perhaps more significantly, he reinforces the personality cult and trappings of power growing around the pharaoh. He is seemingly the first to consistently use the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt, and to have himself always depicted wearing the red and white double crown of the two realms. He takes at least 3 consorts, maybe more, but we know of Seshmetka, Semat, and Serathor. He has numerous children, and when he finally dies, about 2930, after a long and prosperous reign, he's buried at Abydos with 136 sacrificed retainers. And here we have some quotes from the fragments of the Palermo stone, which are our best record of this period, obviously translated from ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, but we have mentions of the construction of canals, of the appearance of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt at various festivals, of smiting some people, of dedicating temples, of sailing trips to, well, we aren't actually sure, I believe, where Sasetni is, but he took sailing trips, and so on. There's more on the stone than just this. There's an entry for every year, I believe, but obviously not in extreme detail, but these are the kind of things a pharaoh was doing at this time. Now, Den is finally succeeded by his son, Onedjib. Onedjib is probably quite old already. Considering his father was on the throne 40 years, Onedjib might have been himself as much as, well, in fairness, 35 or 40 himself, but life expectancy's obviously not what they could be, even for rulers. Onedjib probably only rules about 8 to 10 years before his death. He does add a title meaning the 2 lords to his list, which is probably in reference to the major gods, Horus and Seth, or it might be another reference to Upper and Lower Egypt. He also may make an attempt to exaggerate the length of his reign a bit, or maybe to piggyback on all his time as crown prince while his father was ruling, because there's some ceremonial markings suggesting, sort of claiming, there's a festival that's only held after 30 years on the throne, which he put his name on, but he was probably just piggybacking off of his father's. We've kind of seen through him now after a bit of confusion. He's wed to Betrest, probably among others, but we know of Betrest. Now, unfortunately, some notations we've found reading Calamity on various of his images and marks kind of suggest that his reign does not have a happy ending after 10 years on the throne, although we don't quite know what that calamity might be. But another hint, he is buried in a notably smaller than usual tomb with only 64 followers, which is less than half of his father and about a sixth of Dier, so something was not outstanding about the end of Onedjib's reign, probably. He's followed by Samarkand, who is either his son or possibly his younger brother. We can't be sure. Once we suspected Samarkand was a usurper, but we are pretty sure now that he was legitimate. Unfortunately, he's still ruling in a difficult time for Egypt. The fragments of the Palermo stone I mentioned earlier give us most of this information. Mostly, it gives, the sort of quotes we saw with Den, Horus ceremonies, sailing trips, so on. What it says for the second year of Samarkand's reign is, quote, destruction of Egypt. Now this sounds bad. Plainly, Egypt is not actually destroyed, based on its continued existence thereafter. But one suspects that something went pretty wrong. Now, the most likely suspect is some sort of plague or pestilence, which struck Egypt and killed a great many people. Now, we have no idea what this would have been. Even this is just basically wild speculation on the part of myself, and also more experts than myself have suggested this, but there's no proof. It's not unlikely, though. One of the more significant downsides of civilization before the era of modern medicine is that the dense living conditions do tend to leave humanity pretty vulnerable to outbreaks of disease. It could even be that this plague is the same thing that brought Anejib's reign to an end in calamity, very possibly. But there is no way of knowing for sure. It could have been famine, it could have been raiders, it could have been bad religious omens, who knows. But destruction of Egypt's a pretty dramatic statement, so whatever it was probably wasn't great. Sumeria does, however, survive the destruction of Egypt year and rules for about 8.5 years in all, which isn't a terribly long reign, of course. And he's buried in a rather rushed-looking tomb at Abydos with 67 retainers, which suggests that things still weren't great in Egypt. Apparently his throne was not, or his tomb was not really given a lot of resources prior to his death, and they couldn't spare a lot of retainers either. But he's succeeded about 2910 BCE by Ka. That's Qa'. Ka was probably a son of Sumeria by an unknown consort, and he seems to oversee an end to whatever the crisis was. Maybe it was over already, but in any case, records of his reign aren't extensive exactly, but they refer to the typically expected rituals and ceremonies. No cryptic phrases implying annihilation or anything like that. Not much mention of the smiting of foes or the like either, which suggests Egypt probably was not back to full strength, flexing its muscles on what passed for the international stage. That being said, as we reach 2900, Ka has sat the throne of a probably slowly recovering but stable Egypt for 10 years, and is still a fairly young man. Rumor has it, though, that he doesn't have an heir yet, which could be a problem if he can't get one. He's got time, though. I'm sure it'll happen. 2800 BCE. In Sumeria, they are continuing to push boundaries, even if they can't be bothered to write down their political history somewhere where we can find it in the future, in a reliable form. But they have begun to incorporate phonograms into their writing. Now, all the writing that exists up to this point is essentially ideograms or pictograms. These are characters that represent things or ideas. These phonograms are characters which represent noises, as in, the noises humans make with their mouths. They aren't comprehensive or universal. You can't necessarily write everything using a phonogram yet, and it's not in common usage, anywhere except Sumeria, and even there's still a lot of ideograms being used. But it's a start. And the repercussions of this should be pretty obvious, really. You could use phonograms to write down any language using the same set of characters, any spoken language, using the same set of characters with minimal modifications, and it would require far fewer unique characters in order to encompass all the words in a language. I mean, with ideograms, every idea or item has to be its own symbol. Obviously, there's a lot of cheats that ideogram-based writing systems use, with, slight variations on symbols and so on. But phonograms, you could potentially cut the total number of symbols needed down to only a few dozen, perhaps. And that could be revolutionary in terms of people's ability in the long term to be literate, because it's much easier to learn the fewer characters, the easier it is to learn a written language, you know? So we'll see where this goes. It's not maybe fully there yet, but it's getting there. Aside from that, Sumeria's political instability is continuing to advance. We have no certain idea of everything that's going on, but it seems pretty clear that Uruk is waning while other cities wax, at least to some extent. That's not to say Uruk is still one of, and perhaps even the largest city, but it's no longer a dominant default hegemon. There are many other competing cities now. Now, there's a lot of rumors coming out of the Far East. I can't necessarily confirm any of it, but according to tales from the land of Vietnam, someone has united their tribes as first king of what they call the Hong Bang dynasty. Now, honestly, I think this won't actually happen for another 1,000 of years or so, but it's the claim they make to me at the moment. Similarly, there are a certain legendary 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, which apparently are in China around this time. Also, probably, if they happened, were not for another 1,000 years, but these are what we'd call local ancestry myths, basically. Essentially a sort of mythology, but we do have to consider that things are definitely happening in China and Vietnam, to state the obvious, and these myths probably have grains of truth, of oral traditions, which inevitably oral traditions get mangled over time and can be very hard to interpret with any accuracy, but they might contain grains of the truth that were written down when the legends grains of the truth may have survived to when these legends were finally written down 1,000 years or more later. Unfortunately, that writing is simply the difference at the moment. It's because of writing that we have some real hard knowledge of what's going on in Sumeria and Egypt, which we just don't really have for the rest of the world yet. The difference between history and archaeology, essentially, or literally. Speaking of Egypt, they continue to have the best political records, and they're not slacking in the tech front either. As of about 2874, they have made a calendar which seems to me to work quite well. Now, it's not the first time man has tracked the days, of course. It doesn't take a genius to notice the yearly cycle or to count the days. But the Egyptians have really got it down to a science. They have made a 365-day calendar, which is almost precisely the solar year, divided it into 12 months of 30 days based on the lunar cycle, and then they make up the difference with 5 epigomenal days at the end of the year. You might call them leap days, although technically they're a different concept, but they're just extra days that don't belong to any fixed month. They're sort of their own mini period. These 5 days are some of the holiest in Egypt. Basically, they're considered to be the birthdays of the major gods, the creation period anniversary in a sense. The days themselves are periods of solemn rest. They're considered spiritually unstable and dangerous. The days immediately before and after are the New Year's Eve and New Year's festival days. Now, as for the political side, we begin with Ka, still on the Egyptian throne. He has been for 10 years already, and he reigns for more than another 20. He dies about 2880 BCE after over something on the order of 33 years on the throne. His long reign is a pretty prosperous one, probably one of recovery from whatever happened under his father and grandfather, but nonetheless, seemingly fairly prosperous. He's buried in a large tomb in Abydos. Although with only 26 retainers, this seems less an indicator of a problem and more an indicator that in the post-crisis Egypt, sacrifice of actual human retainers is just falling out of favor personally. Not personally, permanently as a practice. Ka's successors after him will generally prefer to use ushabtis, which are carved imitations of servants that will serve them in the afterlife, rather than actual, breathing, living servants. Now, there's just one problem. Unfortunately, Ka never does have that heir, and it seems at his death there's a bit of a kerfuffle. We've seen a few marks from some dubious fellows known as Snifferka, although that one might have actually been a pseudonym of Ka, a guy who just left behind a Horus bird mark. It's not really clear to us what exactly happened on Ka's death, but the most likely answer is some kind of succession struggle, a military, violent succession struggle. The eventual winner, fortunately, is pretty clear. We're not sure how long it took, but eventually we got Hotep Sekemwi, a royal or Horus name which translates to something like the two powers are reconciled. This is probably a reference to the civil war he had just won, most likely. This is the end of the first dynasty of ancient Egypt. Hotep Sekemwi moves the royal necropolis to Saqqara, which is on the outskirts of the capital at Memphis, and basically abandons the old tombs at Abydos. They become a holy site. Already, even within his lifetime, because the pharaohs as living gods or as divine is already somewhat advanced. Not to the extent it later will be, but it's getting there. And more in future centuries. So, with the Abydos necropolis a holy site, he establishes one in Saqqara for his dynasty. He builds a new royal palace for himself as founder of the second dynasty. Unfortunately, we don't quite know where he came from. He may have been a distant relation of the first dynasty. He may have just been an official or a city ruler or someone who had some kind of power base, which led to him coming out on top in the power struggle. Clearly, he felt, in any case, that he was sufficiently different from the first dynasty that he could make this sort of clean break. We don't know too much about his reign, actually, otherwise, other than his nude palace and his choice to be buried at Saqqara. He reigns 25 years, or possibly 29, and we might or might not have to take some period of civil war out of that. But he does stabilize Egypt once again, and, as I've mentioned about 10 times already, buried at Saqqara. Now, unfortunately, a later ruler does build his own tomb on top of Hotep Sekemwi's, which is really quite inconvenient for future archaeologists. It's not totally destroyed, but it's kind of inconvenient, yeah. It does muddy the waters quite a bit. Somebody building a giant pyramid on top of the tomb. Took quite a while to discover as a result also. But anyway, Hotep Sekemwi is succeeded by his probably son, Nebra, in about 2850 BCE-ish. Unfortunately, the first dynasty's dates are relatively kind of pinned down. They're quite uncertain in this particular period because the dynasty change was a bit messy, and also the second dynasty's tombs are just not as well and clearly preserved and explored as the first dynasty's. They are mostly buried under pyramids because of later rulers building on top of their graveyard, which is just unhelpful. Now, this son, I said Nebra, he might also be called Raneb. Nebra means Lord of the Sun. Raneb means the sun is my lord. Which it is depends mostly on how advanced you think the worship of the sun was in Egypt at this time, which is really not very clear to us. Most evidence suggests it's up and coming at best, and that at this point the sun is still under the control of Horus, and the pharaoh is identified as basically an avatar or aspect of Horus. So that would make Nebra Lord of the Sun the more likely name. The sun, or Ra is my lord, Re is my lord, is probably a later sort of thing. So we're going to call him Nebra. Now, Nebra rules for 10 or 14 years. Which it is depends on whether his father had 25 or 29. In any case, they had 39 between them. And he's buried at Saqqara in a somewhat less grand tomb than his father, which, annoyingly, is also buried under the same later pyramid. Now, Nebra's family is not really attested, but his successor is probably his son, Ninetjer. Ninetjer takes the throne maybe about 2840 BCE, possibly later. Unfortunately, as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty about this time, especially if there was some kind of interregnum between the first and second dynasties. So this information is really unclear. Most likely, as we reach 2800 BCE, Ninetjer is still sitting the throne. Or possibly, by some reckonings, he hasn't even taken the throne yet. That's how much uncertainty there is at this point, unfortunately. But in any case, whenever exactly it happened, Ninetjer does have a long and fairly stable reign. Unfortunately, he's also one of the very first rulers, well, the very first ruler in recorded history to have the bright idea of splitting up his realm between his sons for ease of governance. I suppose the only thing to say in his defense is that at this stage he doesn't actually have any lessons from history to teach him why this might not be a great idea. Spoilers, but it's usually not a great idea. Turns out your sons don't always get along as well as you thought they would. More on that in the next century, though. So as we reach 2800 BCE, the world is continuing to move along. The 5 centers of riverine civilization are all thriving and growing. There's a lot of smaller pockets around the Fertile Crescent. Sumeria has become increasingly divided between warring city-states. To what extent they're openly warring or competing with each other at this point isn't totally clear, but they probably are warring. They're certainly competing. They're probably already openly warring on each other. We don't know what extent exactly, but the answer is almost certainly not that they aren't. Egypt has gone through some struggles lately. There's been a not particularly smooth dynasty change, and now Ninetjer has a maybe not so bright idea for the succession in his head. But it's also still certainly the largest kingdom in the world. I mean, all the Sumerians, although very advanced and dense populations, are still city-states fundamentally. China is moving forward. It's developing its pottery skills and its society. It's definitely not at the level of the Fertile Crescent. It's kind of hard to say exactly what level it is at due to their lack of writing, unfortunately. Same with the Indus River Valley, which is probably in a similar place. They have enough construction and irrigation skills, which could be archaeologically demonstrated, to show that they're developing a pretty complex society of their own, but lack of writing again hurts them on this. Now, the Americas, unfortunately, don't have a settled agricultural society at all, really. Some agriculture, sure, yes, maize particularly, but not a lasting settled civilization, really. There's been a few significant settlements found that existed at times, but none of them quite last. There's no whole belt of functional civilization yet. It's just not there. The agricultural package available is not really as good as in the Middle East, it would seem, and the population is probably overall less dense in the Americas at this point still. So, well, bronze is continuing to spread, held back by a lack of good tin sources still, though. One of these days we'll find some tin. The written languages of Sumeria and Egypt are developing nicely. The arrival of the first phonograms maybe isn't revolutionary yet, but it could be a game changer in future. Uruk maybe is still the leading city-state, but it's really very much up in the air whether it will stay that way. Could reassert itself still. Will we see the Sumerians or the Semites dominate the area in the long run? That could be a confrontation. Probably not exactly on ethnic lines, but it could be. How's Egypt going to handle Ninetjer's interesting succession plans? Well, subscribe and tune in next time to find out. Thanks for watching, everybody.